Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. Just a couple of things to think about as we get into this. If you could please type your name and organization into the chat, that would be most helpful for us. So just a short welcome to you all. I look so forward to having this webinar this morning and talking about MapAction and what they do. First of all, I'm Melinda Laituri. I'm a professor at Colorado State University and the director of the Geospatial Centroid. The reason why I'm part of this is because I was part of a global initiative out of the US Department of State running the Secondary Cities Initiative that looked at 16 different under-examined, under-mapped cities around the world that were prone to natural disasters and other types of disasters. From that event, we had two symposiums that we held at Harvard University. One looked at geospatial applications with respect to the tools and technologies that we use to develop rapid response using maps and data. And the second one addressed things that had to do with sustainability planning. Once we start these kinds of projects, how do we keep them going? How do we maintain the data? Where do we store it? What do we do with it? How do we ensure that other people can use it? So thinking of that context, we're happy to be able to look to MapAction, which began in 2003. And what MapAction does is it assists in providing a disaster response team with access to such things as maps and data, where and when it is needed to help to address disaster events. And so we're hoping that this webinar will spark a conversation about collaboration and partnerships and consider ways to enhance the sustainability of such efforts. So welcome. With that, just let me address a few housekeeping things here before we get started. First of all, you've done your name in the chat, that's great. We will have questions in the Q&A that you can post during the presentations, and we will address those after the presentations have been made. Please don't hesitate if you want to in the chat, use the raise hand icon. If there's things you want to bring up in that setting, you will be muted and we would have to give you permission to speak and to turn on your video as well. And then just to also know that in the chat, you can interact amongst yourselves as you want, but please use the Q&A to post questions for the panelists and the larger conversation. I'm going to share my screen right now to share the poll with you that we would like you to take. And if you notice at the top of this, it has the go to this particular site. You have to open up a new window either on your desktop or use your smartphone. Go to this site and use this code to enter in here. And we have two questions we'd like you to answer. How easy and how effective do you find it to establish project partnerships? You strongly agree, strongly disagree. If you could answer that question, that would be most helpful. And the second question, I can't get to it. The second question is, if it's difficult to form or maintain partnerships, what three things would most help you to achieve that? This is just a short answer to enter some thoughts that you might have about that. We'd like to create a word cloud from your response from that. So again, just to remind you, here's the site, www.menti.com, and the code is 1736083. And I think that's also been placed in the chat for you to find this to participate in the poll. So with that, I think those were the key things I needed to talk with you about. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. This is Alan Mills and Chris Ewing. Alan Mills, both are from MapAction. Alan Mills is a MapAction consultant and volunteer. He's volunteered since 2005 and is a former trustee of MapAction. He leads building data preparedness partnerships, and he's had his own consultancy business specializing in GIS and remote sensing and international development, has 30 years of experience in these operations. Chris is a MapAction trustee and volunteer, and he's a keen physical geographer. I love this, that you're a keen physical geographer. With over 10 years experience in the reinsurance and engineering sectors. In his day job at Aon Impact Forecasting, Chris helps organize and better quantify natural disaster risk. and he's volunteered with MapAction since 2007. So with that, Alan, I'm going to pass it off to you to share your screen and give our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melinda, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be hearing from you, and we look forward to be talking with you this afternoon and this morning. I bring apologies from our Chief Executive of MapAction, who, because of illness in her family, is not able to join us. But I'd like to read out her introduction to you this morning. You may be wondering why MapAction, a disaster mapping organization, is interested in partnering with secondary cities. It stems from the challenges we collectively face, and two challenges in particular. Despite COVID's best efforts, urban growth and climate change look set to be the defining factors of this generation and the next, and possibly several next generations after that. What we do and what we don't do now in preparation can make a huge difference to how things unfold. In MapAction, we often deal with the fallout of what it looks like when extreme climate-related events impact on vulnerable communities. We see the devastation that can result, and we see the millions of lives time and again that are held back from being all that they could be. As the world's population increasingly moves to and is born in cities, we in MapAction are expanding our work on urban centers. Currently, we focus on three areas: preparing for disaster and conflicts response, training and preparing others in partnership and responding with them when it's required, and supporting our partners to respond directly themselves. But if we are to tackle the issues of the future, we need to accelerate the pace of our contribution now. We need to scale our responses and ensure we do this by working with others. It's clear we can only do this through partnerships and networks. The scale of the problem and the interconnectedness of the problem needs to be met with equally scaled and connected solutions. Individuals live in families, communities, nations, and systems. Responding at one level of the system isn't going to be effective unless we also work at all the others. We need to grab that reality in order to make an effective dent on the problem. That is why we in MapAction are so pleased to collect with Melinda and the work that you've been doing, all of you, with the Secondary Cities initiatives. We've been shouting from the rooftops that geospatial analysis, data interoperability, standards and ethics, and the introduction of new relevant technologies are very much part of the solution. But despite our experience in over 100 emergencies since we started in 2003, and despite partnerships with UN agencies, the Red Cross, national disaster management agencies, regional entities, NGOs, and so on, it's still not enough. There is much further to go. That's why it's important to connect with all of you. Academics, modelers, NGO networks, donors, philanthropists, and many more, with all of your connections to see how we can combine our efforts. We bring our knowledge of technologies and our experience of applying them in both tech-rich and tech-poor environments. Finding the right solution to the problem, the right tool for the right user. Allied to your combined experience of projects to address planning, waste, vulnerability, health, accessibility, resilience building, and the other myriad of issues made much more complex and multiplied in city contexts, will be invaluable as we move forward in preparing for, mitigating, and responding to disasters and humanitarian emergencies in the future. We're looking forward to exploring with you how we can partner, how we can use new and emerging technologies, how to maintain data standards and ethics, and apply appropriate governance mechanisms, and all of the other areas that you might be exploring too, to see how we can solve those problems together. For our part, we've put together two presentations. I shall talk about how MapAction's partnerships are essential and effective for mapping in humanitarian crises. And my colleague Chris will demonstrate how we embrace technology to develop appropriate solutions. And then we'll hand the floor over to you. So I'm just going to share my screen now, so hopefully you'll be able to see the presentations. So partnerships are absolutely vital to us since MapAction began. We are delivering mapping services to people who are giving aid to the right place, to the right people, after a very serious emergency. And those partners have been on the ground, those needing information to make decisions, reporting their findings, coordinate the response, pledge for donor funds, and communicate with the disaster-affected communities. We also partner up with people who are supporting us with data and services. We partner with those who are in a good strategic position to assist us. And we've also been training people in many of the skills we possess, not just teaching the software, but the context of how those skills can be used in a response effectively. If we understand and sensitize the environment that MapAction walks into in responses, we can be better prepared to deal with what we find. And that involves working in partnerships before the disaster occurs, as well as on the ground in the event. It's interesting to look back at the timeline of how our partnerships have evolved. We started by going in at the top level, the international surge community, particularly organizations such as OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and their disaster and coordination team, UNDAC, who were in the early years our primary partner on the ground. But also with sectoral agencies who are doing a lot of the aid giving after a disaster response. UNICEF looking after the children, WFP delivering food and logistics, and also specialist groups doing things like search and rescue, the INSARAG group, we've worked very closely with them. And that naturally evolved into working with the Red Cross movement, who are so heavily involved in disaster management and disaster response, whether it be the Federation, actually out in the field delivering goods, ICRC working more in the conflict zone, or with national societies on the ground. I bring up Trinidad and Tobago there because I remember doing a project on vulnerability in communities many years ago there. And also being on the ground, we also were working with large NGOs such as Save the Children, Oxfam, Mercy Corps and such like. And also with specialist projects like the ACAPS project, who are delivering humanitarian data and analysis about scenarios and both sudden onset and longer term crises that occur across the world. In more recent years, we've looked to regional agencies which are now appearing and are wanting to deliver help for their own communities. So the Caribbean, CARICOM, have their disaster emergency agency, SEDEMA, and their slogan is a Caribbean response for a Caribbean problem. CSDR is a Central Asian regional group, which we've been recently trying to build capacity with. And the AHA Center, the ASEAN response agency, the humanitarian agency in the Southeast Asia. And then finally, we've dug down a few times to national governments, and I put up 3 examples here, Zambia, Vanuatu, and Dominica, that shows our geographical spread, where we've actually tried to go down to the national level to help them identify what data they can use in a response. But as time's going on, you know, we want to work more closely with others who are now in humanitarian information management. When MapAction started, we were the only kids on the block. Before we started, for instance, search and rescue could be seen using hand-drawn maps of cities in Lonely Planet guides to set up search sectors for the response in the 1990s. But now there are many other players out there. For instance, we actively seek to share data through portals like HDX. Chris will talk about more about this later. We look to working with OpenStreetMap, in particular the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, or HOT, for filling data gaps when we're in the field. And we're exploring how to link with their project Audacious to build crowd mapping capacity in those countries and cities where disasters are common or crises are prolonged. We partner with Carto NG to share our resources and experience to jointly work on mapping projects. And we not only reach out to professional associations such as EURESA, the Association for Geographic Information, and the Royal Geographical Society, speaking at their events and so on, but often we're seen at the forefront of raising public awareness of the importance of geography and geographers with our groundbreaking work during emergency response. Chris will talk more about data sources, sharing and analysis later, but I just want to hone in on the proliferation of services offered by satellite imagery and aerial photography, including from unmanned aerial vehicles. They give a lot of potential for improved data sources. Traditionally, we've used the Space Charter and the services of the UN's own remote sensing organization, UNISAT, to obtain derived products that help us in emergencies. Where are the flood extents? How many buildings have been damaged in a hurricane? In the past, we've been offered many gigabytes of satellite imagery, which is inappropriate to send to our field teams who are working off the flimsiest of internet bandwidths. We want to make more use of remote sensing technology and data, but the reason I explore this under partnerships, not technology, is we realize end users like MapAction have to frame the discussion. So now we actively engage with private companies and others to understand our needs in the field better, so they can design appropriate tools and data that will really help. The other aspect of our new work is that we are looking at new areas of the humanitarian response, and civil society is one of these. So they're often the prime responders after an event and provide a wide range of essential aid and services. They're also the link with many development programs and help communities build resilience and build back better after an emergency. But their profile is low internationally, and their geomaturity is also low. So MapAction has identified these two areas as part of our current strategy, raising the awareness of the work of CSOs, that what they do in emergency, and linking their efforts seamlessly into the government and the international coordination efforts, and identifying appropriate GI technology that will help CSOs with their own response and resilience operations. Civil society organizations range from small community projects to international NGOs. So we're looking, we can't deal with all of that in one go. We need to look to those larger organizations who have grassroots counterparts as their partners, such as Oxfam, or self-help networks such as the Asian Disaster Risk Reduction Network. And we want to work on projects with them, the experiences of which can be shared more widely across their memberships. In COVID times, we've had substantive projects with Oxfam in Kenya, mapping all the agencies conducting cash aid programs, and those working in water, sanitation and hygiene sector, distributing fresh water to urban slums in the country. So this year, we're making progress in that area. The other major focus, which secondary cities members will be very interested in, is how we can improve information management in urban disasters. We've worked in responses focused on urban areas for many years. The Haiti earthquake in 2010, and in 2019, flooding in Djibouti in Africa, and this year after the explosion in Beirut. But we're still working out what more we can do to ensure the complexity of an urban region, its density, dynamics, and diversity is properly understood by responders to a disaster. Here are some of the elements that we want to develop. Researchers in humanitarian aid are identifying how complex urban systems means you need sensitive planning in aid programs to avoid doing more harm to both individuals and existing systems and livelihoods. What's lacking is often the detailed geography of those systems. In particular, we want to be able to give context of what any surge support after emergency needs to understand before implementing both direct or cash aid, and share that more widely amongst responders. Connected with this, the level of detail of data needed to reflect those complex urban systems is much more. For example, in Djibouti, we were able to get down to quartier level, like neighborhoods in the US, detail which allowed us to discriminate between poorer, more vulnerable populations and those who were able to cope with the aftermath of the flood. Finally, part of that city understanding will include understanding before an emergency how vulnerable different neighborhoods are, how exposed are they to hazards that may put them at risk, and what coping capacity do they have. Both our theoretical urban work and the practical collaboration with CSO networks will help improve this. And we hope we might be able to find ways of working with secondary cities members in urban response. Some of the issues we might consider are, what are the development concerns that are also humanitarian concerns? Part of the Sendai framework is to bridge any perceived gap between what we count as humanitarian and what we count as development. In cities, this is so linked to vulnerability, but also development programs to improve health, livelihood opportunities, better water, sanitation and hygiene are so critical when a disaster happens. And local data and local partners, local knowledge and local resources to respond, they are the ones that can link development to humanitarian programs. The other aspect we're interested in is the growth of cities and planning. we're not just seeing our work as short-term projects, but working out longer-term programs and systems which can evolve as cities expand even further and new challenges emerge, particularly in the peri-urban or hinterland area, which is often the most rapidly growing and contains some of the poorest and most vulnerable of the populations. Finally, I just want to explore quickly about how we aim to partner. Traditionally, we've been seen as a service provider. We have an end user whose needs can be identified, and we can produce outputs that we can hand over, whether they be maps, data, or tools. We've not only done this in disaster response directly on the ground, but passed on our expertise through capacity building in preparedness consultancy and direct training of tools and systems. And we share any maps we can publish on our map data repository, right back to when MapAction started. And you can find other tools on the website, guides to mapping, tools, standard symbols. This year, we also started our global hub, where anyone can leave a message requesting for one of our services. And this has been increasingly important as we've had to work so much remotely this year. But we are becoming an influencer. We've realized that our experience is unique and valued, and we're increasingly using that to influence high-level policy. Primarily UNGGIM, what I like to refer to as the global parliament of geographers. Their integrated geospatial information framework has 9 thematic areas that are influencing national ability to be GIS ready, data prepared, and have policies to share information between all GI players, including those in disasters. The disaster working group has a strategic framework that lays out the specific policy issues for disaster management. MapAction plays an important advisory role, both within the UK's delegation to the major parliament, as I called it, and as a member of the working group on disasters, one of only a few NGOs involved in the process. We also sit on other advisory groups and offer one-on-one advice to specific agencies, such as UK's DFID, now the FCDO, and other donors, and the United Nations Information Management Working Group for Humanitarian Issues. But as we've moved from being the only kid on the block to one of several agencies in an increasingly complex humanitarian world, we seek to work much more collaboratively. We're bringing technologists and humanitarians together, often brokering the relationships, as I mentioned, with the remote sensing community, and seeking to learn as much from our partners as they get services from us, in particular to respond to humanitarian trends in localization and subsidiarity. What does that mean? The aid of the future will be delivered at an appropriate level, whether that be local, urban, country, region, or global. And those already working on the ground often have skills and knowledge that we need to take on board. And also reaching out to our technologists and academic connections to develop the right solutions. Finding collaborative spaces, making the right partnerships which are active, respectful, and share the appetite to solve humanitarian problems will play an increasing role in our organization as we move forward. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Chris, who will take us into the technology.
Thanks, Alan. That's great. Just turning my video on there. Yeah, thanks. So Alan covered partnerships. I'm going to look at the subject from a technological point of view. So the next few slides will just kind of take you through how we're using technology, but also how we're using technology in some of our urban responses, and also with our partners as well to deliver better, basically. Next slide, please. So really, it's all about the data. So it's really the heart of all that we do, whether that's from data acquisition or whether that's from data acquisition in terms of the needs, and they might be different if we're in a disaster response setting or if we're in a disaster risk reduction setting. And then moving to data storage. How do we store that data that we maybe get from our own data collection in a disaster response phase, or from other parties as well, whether that's government or different NGOs that are involved in a response. So that's the key thing. And as Alan mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more, the map and data repository. And then we go on to how we visualize the data and how we use that for our own analysis. That's about summarizing data effectively, showing changes in data, and that's been key over the last few months with the global pandemic situation and the projects we've been involved in, and really moving from static data to how data may change over time. And the next one would be around how our products and outputs are delivered. And that's, again, kind of moved from the static map to more of a data dashboard, introducing things like timelines and interactive dashboards of how we want to show a changing situation. Then we move on to the output and how we provide our maps and our data products and how we distribute those. So as well as those being available on the MapAction website, we also share data extensively, and that's through things like HDX, Relief Web, GDAX, the virtual RSOC. So some of these are UN-based systems, but also through the wider humanitarian system as well. And really what we want to do with this whole process from data acquisition to distribution is concentrate on making that process more efficient. And as we undertake more and more projects with an urban context, we want to make sure that the base data is there behind all of that. So that's a key challenge, is to obtain that base data, but also share data that we create and add to, and also share that back with the wider community. Next slide, please. So if we think about the last few months, the coronavirus pandemic has really brought a lot of new ways of working for all of us. And we've obviously seen a lot more remote working. We've seen, from a MapAction point of view, and really an escalation of requests. And that's, as Alan mentioned earlier, one of the things we brought in was the global hub on our website to enable people to ask and make requests of us, and also find out information from the website too. But that was really about prioritizing some of the requests that we were getting and be able to help people better. There's also been a lot of new tools in this virtual environment. So that's led to a change in approach as well. So whereas we would be in situ or in field in a disaster response setting, we have done that as well for Beirut. I'll tell you something about the Beirut response shortly. But we've also had to look at more virtual ways of working. So that might be new tools such as Jira that we're using in our workflow as a support ticket system. It might be more collaborative workspaces and using things like Google Drive and Google File Stream, and working with partners as we deliver on these projects in collaborative workspaces as well. Also a shift in how we volunteer. So MapAction is made up of around 70 volunteers as well as about 20 full-time staff, but our volunteers have moved from and I'm a volunteer myself, moved from a kind of short-term full-time working scenario, which might be a 2-week deployment somewhere in the field, to more of a kind of long-term part-time evenings and weekends type approach. So we've seen a shift in how we respond to projects as well. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think that we've really kind of increased our use of things like Google Docs and of the online working as well. I think that's enabled us to be a bit more responsive as well. On to the next slide, please. Follow, a slightly different response. So, as we all know, on the 4th of August this year, there was a huge explosion in the port city of Beirut, which caused at least 200 deaths, 6,500 injuries, and about £15 billion in property damage, with leaving an estimated 300,000 people homeless. So, with a few hours of that event occurring, we were asked to respond by the UN's Disaster Assessment Coordination Team, and we were able to respond in person. So we had a team that were there in the field, within a couple of days. And before we attended, we were able to provide some remote damage assessment, as you can see on the top left exhibit there. But really, it was about providing mapping and data management support to the UN teams, but also international NGOs and local NGOs as well. So we really used technology in a number of ways there through our response, and we had a remote field team back in the UK that were able to deal with some of the tasks that the team in the field didn't have time for, and also kind of make, the team therefore looked a bit bigger in the field than just the 3 people that were there. They were supported by volunteers back in the UK. And you can see some other example. There's many more on the website as well in the Maps and Data repository, but on the right hand side, just looking at the sectors within Beirut, and then being able to produce an assessment of the situation there. So yeah, that was Beirut back in August. Next slide, please. So I hope that gave you a bit of context of how we've been working and how we've been responding over the last few months. You know, one of the things, and this doesn't really just apply to the pandemic, but in general, when we're developing our information products and maps, we really want to deliver, you know, best practice. And we worked with CART-ONG on some guidance of, you know, making effective maps and effective decision-making products in a pandemic, but can also be applied, you know, outside of that. So, you know, there's many examples out there of good and bad practice in terms of visualization, but we really want to highlight the you know, the things that the kind of top 10 things that should be done. So whether that's, you know, being original and, you know, keeping it simple, really kind of giving context to the data that you're trying to display, you know, finding the balance between perfection and what might be good enough for a situation. You know, just all those different aspects we wanted to put together. So you can find out a bit more of that. There's a blog article with a link at the bottom of the page, and we can share that as well. So I think there's probably a number of parallels, you know, especially in an urban context, at a you know, a very local scale, about how you want to develop information products and mapping products, and how you know, they can be as communicative as possible. And I think there's a lot of parallels there with the work that was done on Secondary Cities project. So yeah, hopefully that people will find that interesting. And let's, yeah, next slide, please. And just taking that theme a little bit further. So Alan mentioned already the map and data repository that we have. We also have on the website, the MapAction website, an example product catalog. So, you know, when we're, whether that's a disaster response project or a disaster risk reduction project or an emergency preparedness project, we want to be guided by stakeholder requirements. And that's, you know, obviously a communication with our stakeholders and our partners as to what is needed in a specific context. So, but we do have some examples already. So you can see on the example product catalog on the website, we have some examples for WASH, which is water and sanitation and hygiene, for health, and for food security. So that they are examples of what might work best in a given situation. So you don't want to make you know, an example, an information product that's too cluttered or doesn't really fit its purpose. So these can be used both in a emergency planning and a disaster response context. But what we want to do is kind of guide that discussion, but also obviously get input from stakeholders and beneficiaries as to, you know, what types of information and how we can pull that information together for people. So on the next slide, yeah, we're talking a little bit about improving data sharing. Alan already mentioned a little bit about how we deliver data through HDX and making sure that the data, as well as the maps that we deliver, are interoperable. So we obviously need good data, and we need access to good data to be able to you know, derive good information and make decisions effectively. And one of the challenges is that, you know, data might often be out of date, or we might have the wrong version of the data. So really having a consistent and timely source of data, such as HGX and things like the common operational data set, is really helpful. So we're really, you know, working with other agencies to make sure that that happens. And that might be as simple as things like a common set of place names, and a common set of administration areas as well when we're in a country, so that everyone that's responding to that disaster has a good understanding of, you know, the name of a given region or a given urban area. You know, it sounds quite simple, but there may be multiple names for places and so on. So it really helps to be able to have that common source of data. So yeah, as we look, you know, also bringing in different themes, that's interoperability, but also bringing in different themes around data science and sharing our lessons learned as well. So we've definitely seen a shift, you know, over the last years, and move more to visualizing dynamic information. So, you know, we want to help more and more telling stories with that data, and having a good handle on the data is key in that respect. You know, making sure that you know, dynamic data can be delivered effectively, and also that we're keeping on top of that changing data and presenting it effectively. So yeah, there's a couple of example dashboards at the bottom right and the bottom left there of some work we've done over the last few months for the coronavirus response. And yeah, just really kind of describing here some challenges and opportunities and some next steps in terms of technology as well. So, you know, our strategy really evolves and adapts, and, you know, we want to make better and more efficient emergency preparedness and disaster response decisions, and we can help, you know, with that. We're really got a kind of moonshot vision as to how we want to continue to use data and technology and what we do, but also outward looking as well. So we want to work with partners on how best to you know, make that whole process more efficient, so that data can be, you know, reused and time again, and not just data that's in a silo for a specific project or response. You know, questions around how open your data is a key here, really, to make sure that as the data we produce is open and shareable, we want to try to make sure that we can you know, make use of other people's data as well, and that's available to everybody. So yeah, in an urban setting as well, there's really an importance for clear and consistent mapping on that urban scale. So as Alan mentioned already, working with other organisations such as Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team and others like that, and we, you know, really welcome the opportunity to work more with initiatives like the Secondary Cities project. And I guess that, you know, as well as the, you know, operational partnership, there's also the opportunity for the partnership to provide a step change in terms of data sharing and technical development as well. So, you know, some examples from that I've just given there hopefully highlight some of the partnerships that they're working through, and how you know, a kind of shared vision on data and technology helps. And the next slide, please. So that kind of concluded my section on technology. I think now we have a few questions for you that we'd like to hopefully prompt you know, some questions back to us, really. So kind of three themes here around partners, you know, quality solutions and better use of networks. So you know, in terms of partners, how would you, the audience, like really to engage with us? How would you like to work with us? And you know, how can we enable that, really? You know, in terms of providing quality solutions, and really that is fitness for purpose in an urban context, you know, how can we use, again, how can we make best use of the partnerships and technology in these situations? And really on the third one, you know, this question is really around open data and open data environments. What we want to do is work on providing data in an open format and making sure that's easy to, you know, easily shared with people as well. But is there anything else that we could be doing, other initiatives, you know, that we can work with? And, you know, do people have thoughts on that? That would be really interesting. So yeah, with that, that's yeah, probably back to Melinda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris and Alan. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Before we go there, just a reminder to please revisit the poll. I just reposted it and set it up, so you should be able to access that. Please type in the chat if you have any problems with accessing it. So the first question that I would like to direct towards both our panelists is talking about data protection. So data protection, particularly within Europe with the privacy regulations that have been established there, is this having an impact on the humanitarian sector and how you're collecting data? Some things you might want to comment about that, risks and challenges, and if COVID has had an impact.
Yeah, I can start the debate off on this one. That yeah, you know, everybody in Europe has been struggling to get to grips with GDPR over the last couple of years, and you know, that has had impacts both internally for how we organize ourselves and how we deal with data. I'd like to open up the debate about, you know, it's all the issues of data ethics, really. You know, we have a responsibility that the primary aim of what we're trying to do is to relieve the suffering of those who are in need of humanitarian aid. And if we're exposing them to more risk, then we're actually doing a worse job than if we just ignored them. That is a big challenge when what we want to do as well is disaggregate population data and understand who are the more vulnerable, who are the poorer people who cannot support themselves. So, you know, I don't think we have all the solutions, but I think this is a debate that needs to be ongoing within the the humanitarian community. And we've actually been having recent discussions with the Association for Geographic Information in the UK about something called the Benchmark Initiative, which was actually looking at those issues. And I encourage people to have a look at that because it's giving us some ideas of where we go next with that. Chris, I don't know whether you want to pitch in with that too.
Not on this one. Yeah, I think you've covered pretty much everything there. I think like you say, the kind of primary objective is to obviously help our the people we want to help the most, and in most cases, that might there will be issues potentially with disaggregating data and so on. But I think it's through learning more about the process that we'll be able to help for sure.
And I'll just follow up quickly on that as well. I think this question of vulnerable populations is so critical. And not only do we have existing vulnerable populations, but we have emerging vulnerable populations due to COVID. And so how do we identify these populations? How do we know who they are? And how do we start to address some of these the huge second order impacts that are coming out of the pandemic due to economic closures and these kinds of things? So it definitely is a real challenge. It definitely speaks to this issue of data ethics, but also more importantly to the existing rules and regulations that are in place as we start to collect these kinds of data. So for us to make this more public, for us to make this more understandable across different sectors and populations who may use this data is critically important for us to do as sort of shepherds of these kinds of data. We have another question here. Oh, I'm sorry, did anyone want to comment further?
I guess I was trying to, just thinking about that a bit further. I mean, in terms of our the way that we publish some of our data, then I think that's almost kind of built in that process. So we have a data sharing mechanism, and as you would expect, really. And in terms of some data that we can obviously share, but other parts of the types of data we can't share. So just really echoing what you said there. Yeah.
So we have another question here, and the question is, what experience have MapAction had of forming local urban partnerships? And what particular opportunities or challenge has that presented? I'll open that up to you, but I have some comments from the Secondary Cities Initiative, but I'll let both Chris and Alan address this first.
Thank you. As I mentioned in my presentation, this is a relatively new area for us to really be digging into. We've been thinking about the theory of it and how to engage over the last year or so. And it is going to be a challenge. I think as I made clear, the CSO community is very diverse, very variable in size, influence, what they actually consider to be humanitarian efforts, and what they do in the development world as well. It's incredibly diverse, and trying to get a handle on that is quite difficult. So even within a small urban city, if secondary city or even smaller, you may have dozens and dozens of civil society organizations, each with their own priorities working there. So I think how we can effectively engage that and move it forward, particularly when we're looking specifically at information management, mapping, use of GIS and remote sensing technology, we're going to have to shout quite hard to balance all the other priorities that CSOs are dealing with as well. And as I also mentioned, many of those organizations at the moment don't have a lot of experience of using geo information and GIS. We want to try and make it as simple and as open source and as free as possible there in anything that we do. Chris.
Yeah, just to echo that. I think in terms of the responses we've had as MapAction with partners, a lot of those. You mentioned on Haiti back in 2010 and other disaster response we've been on. I mean, a lot of those will be in an urban context, won't they? In terms of the way we deploy, we'll be in that urban environment. There'll often be much kind of wider scale disasters, but there's definitely always an urban part to the work that we're doing. But yeah, I think it's for us it's identifying how we can support further partnerships with technology as well. So I think we're on that journey, aren't we? Yeah.
Just a couple comments from the Secondary Cities Initiative. So we had 16 different cities across the globe in different countries where we were looking at this very issue of enhancing geospatial capacity with respect to disaster preparedness, resilience, and human security. Having said that, we partnered with universities. We saw universities as islands of stability in many of these locations. They had the resources, they had computer labs, they had young people who are eager to learn and be part of this activity, and to be they're the future in these different countries, to be able to train them up in a way to start to address these critical issues. So the universities were central, partnering with local government to include training opportunities for those in local government, but also create a pipeline for students to have internships at those local government agencies and potentially get employment. And then finally, to partner, as was mentioned earlier, with the civil society organizations that oftentimes also have expertise and resources to bring to bear to facilitate this kind of coordination. So I think this is ripe for opportunity, and to think about how to build on these kinds of partnerships and this kind of discussion can facilitate that.
Just to add on to that, Melinda, I think your important point here is that we don't see these different sectors of the humanitarian response as different communities. We're trying to bring them together. A city like Manila, you know, we need to know the CSO networks, we need to know the barangay mayors, the metro mayors, and also how that interacts with both the national government and the international response mechanism. It's a headache to sort out, and it's going to take us several years in each city, I think. But, you know, we've got to think on that kind of framework. Otherwise, we're just going to have a set of silos doing their own things.
I have two issues. One person wrote in the chat, and this is a quick question, I think, is how can someone volunteer with a GIS background with you? How can they volunteer with MapAction?
It's a great question, and we get so many questions like that throughout the year. We actually only take on a few new volunteers each year, and unfortunately we're just coming to the close of a recruitment process where we've taken on 6 new volunteers. Fortunately, I think we're going to be starting up the rotation again very early next year, so look out on the website. If you can join us on Facebook or Twitter, we'll send out messages there about the recruitment process. Primarily we want to have things like GIS experts, but you know, as time goes on, you can see we're evolving our services. So there's much more about data scientists, people who are project managers, people who have experience in the field of dealing with things like civil society organization work and humanitarian efforts on the ground. More practitioners are also, you know, very valuable. I think, again, we're not going to become a specialist group just looking at GIS. There's a wide range of skills that we'll be asking for, and we get great benefit, particularly from people back at home in their offices doing a lot of software development and really nice gizmos that I'm afraid I'm too old to be able to be a technologist anymore.
So we have 2 more questions here. I think we'll have time for those 2. We only have a few more minutes left in our webinar. Both of these, they're challenging questions. So from Adrian, who asked an equally challenging question earlier. Many NGOs are facing difficulties with financing because of de-risking when banks block their accounts using the regulation against anti-money laundering and terrorism. Have you heard or faced some similar challenges when working with NGOs in conflict zones?
Yeah, we're very much aware of this, and as much as we were talking about data ethics before for the individuals who are affected, you know, we've got to be very careful about some of the organizations who are working on the ground in very vulnerable countries and within conflict zones. Again, I'm not sure we have any particular solutions right now, but those challenges exist, and I think we've just got to be incredibly sensitive towards them. And if we're dealing with a new CSO organization that may be vulnerable to that, we have to have that discussion up front with them to make sure that we're protecting their interests. But you know, they're doing great work out there, and I can't deal with the bank accounts, I'm afraid, but the actual sensitivity issue is very important.
So one other question that's being asked is, and this is a great question, how does MapAction promote sustainable and ongoing use of the data and the training provided? Do you monitor the ongoing use of data to assess how it's used beyond the immediate response?
Yeah, we have a range of different monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that we adopt after a response and into sort of 6 months afterwards, seeing whether how the response helped, how our mapping and outputs actually helped. The capacity building is of personal interest to me, being the preparedness coordinator. And I think training is often seen as the sort of first entry in and the easiest route in to help an organization build capacity. But we're very sensitive of, putting in all the other components, such as, understanding the policy and procedures, making sure the manpower, person power is in there, making sure that data, which is, the lifeblood of any GIS, is actually sitting there and usable. There's no point in creating these systems unless you've got that. So yes, we're really careful that we want to try and encourage organizations to think the whole system through and look at a long-term sustainability plan. I think that's very much in our minds at the moment.
Yeah, and I think this is really, really important. I really appreciate this question, because also it's about getting the data into other people's hands. And when I say that, I'm saying that, schools can use this as a resource. Once young people are understanding the geospatial perspective and point of view, that's a very powerful way to look at the world around them and be able to contribute to what's happening. So creating accessibility to these data, it may be creating something as simple as a city atlas or map book to get that data in their hands, to creating posters around the city, to doing billboards, alternative ways of getting this information out there that's exciting and that can have people understand how these data can be used beyond the technical approach, which is so important as well. But again, that kind of outreach activity. There's one other question that came in, maybe it got answered. People were wondering if you were only accepting UK-based volunteers.
Yeah, I think our colleague Jess has answered that online,
okay,
that anybody outside of UK can be considered, and these days with remote working, I think the chances are that you might be taken on board a little bit faster.
So I'm not seeing any other questions posted. I think we're almost at the end of the hour here. I would like very much to thank everyone for participating. Please visit the MapAction website. You can get some more information about MapAction. You can visit the Secondary Cities website too and check out our program. And beyond that, thank you so much for participating, and we hope to collaborate with you in the future. Thank you.